Imagine a city where at night there is no one but you and the darkness. No patrol on the corner, no familiar silhouette in uniform. No one who would even appear if something bad is already emerging from the alley. You walk on wet cobblestones, hear footsteps behind you, turn around, and see no one. And in the morning, a body is found 2 blocks away. And the main horror here isn't even the crime itself. The main horror is that there was no one to watch. Today, this is almost impossible to imagine. It seems natural to us that a big city has eyes, ears, and feet. That there is a patrol. There is a precinct. There is someone who is supposed to watch the street before trouble happens. But relatively recently, the state did not consider this its direct duty. The law existed, courts existed, prisons existed. Punishment after a crime, yes. The constant presence of authority on the street, not yet. Right where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. And it was in this void between the crime and the arrival of authority that one of the most important institutions of the New World was born. Not just a city service, not just another reform, but a mechanism that forever changed the relationship between the individual, the street, and the state. In London's archives, a document from 1829 is preserved, an order for the issuance of the first batch of breast badges for the newly established Metropolitan Police. Each badge is numbered. Each is supposed to belong to a specific constable. But among the numbers, there are several strange ones. They are reserved but officially assigned to no one. No name, no explanation, no comment. And the most curious thing is that precisely such numbers appear in citizens' complaints about unknown officers who were allegedly seen on the streets even before the police formally began to exist. This is our entry point into history, because this is not just about crime, and not just about the fear of night streets. It's about that moment when authority decided for the first time not just to punish after the fact, but to be constantly present in urban life. It stepped onto the street, pinned on a badge, and never left again. If you like such stories, where familiar things suddenly open up from a completely different side, put a like and write 1 in the comments. And if not, write 0. Let's see how close this format is to you at all. And now let's return to that world where cities had already become huge, but authority on their streets remained surprisingly weak. The beginning of the 19th century did not smell of progress. It smelled of coal, soot, sewage, and wet stone. A heavy brown haze hung over London. Paris choked in narrow old streets designed for a completely different scale of life. Berlin, Vienna, St. Petersburg. The picture was similar everywhere. The city grew faster than rules could appear to contain that growth. Masses of people flocked to new centers of trade and labor. Houses became denser. Courtyards darkened. Alleys grew narrower. And authority, despite all the external brilliance of states, was almost absent at the city's most vulnerable point. And this absence must be truly felt, not as an abstract historical fact, but as a daily reality. After sunset, the street ceased to be an extension of the law. It became something else. In some places, a night watch still remained. Somewhere you could meet a watchman. Somewhere a city inspector would appear in response to an alarm. But there was no constant, predictable, systematic presence of the state on the street yet. A void gaped between a person and danger. Newspapers of that time read almost like frontline reports. An attack near the theater, a robbery on a bridge, a body found at dawn, a theft right in a crowded market. But behind all these cases lies the same detail. Authority almost always arrived afterward. After the scream, after the blow, after the death, after the panic. Preventative presence did not exist as a norm. To us, this seems absurd. A huge city, the center of an empire, the capital of trade, politics, money, and at night, it seems to sink into unsupervised shadow. But that's exactly how it was. And that is why the appearance of a man in uniform on a corner later would become not just a technical novelty, it would become a symbol of a revolution. Not only because he could stop someone, but because his very silhouette changed the meaning of the street. It ceased to be no one's. But to understand why this turning point became possible precisely then, we must first see what the big city itself was like. Because outwardly, it looked like a triumph of order. But inside, it was already beginning to crack at the seams. European cities of the early 19th century loved grandeur. St. Petersburg amazed with its avenues, palaces, columns, embankments, and an almost theatrical confidence in its purpose. London raised banks, cathedrals, parliamentary facades, towers, and districts over its streets, as if designed to outlast entire eras. Paris, even before later reconstructions, was already a capital where authority loved to speak the language of stone. The stone was supposed to inspire respect, a sense of scale, and most importantly, a feeling of stability. But the big city of that time was built as a two-faced space. The ceremonial facade promised order. The real, everyday layer concealed chaos. Just turn off a lit street, and behind a rich building, a completely different life began. Rooms without windows, overcrowded flophouses, alleys where filth stood for weeks, courtyards where light almost never reached, child labor, markets for stolen goods, basement workshops, the stench of open sewers next to the most respectable places. This very contrast was the main nerve of the era. The city spoke of grandeur, but did not control itself from within. It knew how to make an impression. It knew how to demonstrate power. It knew how to organize a ceremony. But it did not know how to make its own inner life transparent and safe. The external brilliance concealed not order, but its lack. It's important to understand this was not a random oversight. It was a systemic feature of the early industrial city. It was built for power, capital, trade, military logistics, reputation, not for the comfort and safety of all who lived in it. Therefore, behind the facades, what did not fit the city's official image but defined its everyday reality quickly accumulated. And here a dangerous question arises. If a capital can look like a symbol of law, and 100 meters from this symbol, a space living by its own rules already begins, then who actually controls the city? For a long time, the answer was uncomfortable. The state controlled the city partially. Administratively, yes. Ceremonially, yes. Symbolically, yes. But in the very fabric of the street, its power remained intermittent. And yet, until the industrial explosion, cities somehow held on. So the old world had its own system of stability. And to understand why it collapsed, we need to return to where safety was ensured not by a uniform, but by recognizability. Before the Industrial Revolution, cities were smaller, not only in population, they were smaller in a social sense. People lived in a space where almost everyone had a face, a past, and a place in the local hierarchy. Guilds, parishes, neighborhoods, trades, families, reputations. All of these functioned as a recognition system. A person was rarely completely nameless. Anonymity was the exception, not the rule. Yes, night watches existed even then. Various cities had patrols, rounds, watchmen, armed individuals who patrolled the streets, dispersed obvious troublemakers, and ensured at least a basic level of calm. But this was not yet the police in the modern sense. These structures protected property, helped maintain the familiar local order, and controlled the most blatant violations. They did not operate as a comprehensive urban institution of prevention. The old system was based on a different principle. Its main weapon was mutual knowledge. A suspicious person stood out. A stranger was noticeable. Reputation preceded the individual. If someone was known as a thief, a brawler, or a troublemaker, that knowledge spread faster than any official document. The community remembered. And it was this communal memory that served as the first line of defense. But the industrial city shattered this foundation with almost frightening speed. People poured into Manchester, London, Liverpool, Paris, Berlin, St. Petersburg by the thousands. They rented corners of rooms, changed lodgings, went to factories, disappeared, moved, returned, and got lost in the flow. A person was no longer anchored to a community. They might have no stable reputation in a new place. No one knew who they were yesterday. No one could vouch for them today. And here emerges the key word of this entire story: anonymity. In a medieval or early modern town, a criminal risked being recognized. In an industrial metropolis, they could vanish into the crowd. Not because they became more cunning, but because the city itself, for the first time, gave them that opportunity. The big city didn't just gather people, it erased the old lines of recognition between them. From this point on, the old urban stability begins to crumble. Communal memory weakens. Personal reputation ceases to be a universal shield. The street becomes a space where thousands of people are physically close, but socially alien to one another. And as soon as this new environment fully takes shape, another order begins to grow within it. Not a state order, but a very effective one. When the city became anonymous, the void on the street did not remain empty for long. It was quickly filled by those who understood the new logic of the big city better than anyone else. Where the state's presence was sporadic, its own power grew. Unofficial, street level, often criminal, sometimes semi-criminal, but in any case, very real. The London chronicles of the first decades of the 19th century are striking not only for the number of crimes, but also for the sense that entire districts lived by their own rules. Robberies, trade in stolen goods, fraud, child exploitation, pickpockets, muggers at theater entrances, gangs in port districts. All of this was not chaotic noise, but part of a stable urban environment. A similar picture could be seen in other major European cities. The names were different, the forms varied, but the logic was the same. Where official authority was not constantly present, a parallel one emerged. The nighttime city showed this stratification especially clearly. By day, the street still belonged to commerce, service, transport, the official rhythm. By night, it changed hands. There was a sense that a second city existed, with its own hierarchy, its own rules of safety, its own ways of survival. And this second city could not simply be abolished by decree, because it grew from the very fabric of anonymous life. Contemporaries sometimes describe the night streets as a kind of separate state. Not literally, of course, but very close in feeling. This space had its own intermediaries, its own territories, its familiar routes, its hidden agreements. A person who didn't know these rules was at far greater risk than one who could read them. The most important thing here is that the authorities were not blind. They knew what was happening. Newspapers wrote about it. It was discussed in city councils. It appeared in court documents. Yet a professional, permanent urban police force still did not emerge immediately. And here begins the truly uncomfortable question. Why did the state tolerate, right under its nose, spaces where its own presence was weaker than that of the street? The answer lies partly in the fear of its own strengthening. Because for many people of that time, constant state surveillance on the street seemed no less a threat than crime itself. Europe of the late 18th and early 19th centuries lived under the strong impression of the idea of freedom. Not an abstract freedom from beautiful speeches, but freedom from arbitrary state interference in daily life. After long centuries of court arbitrariness, denunciations, secret surveillance, and administrative weight, the idea that power should be limited sounded almost liberating. Law, yes. Courts, yes. Punishment after a proven crime, yes. But a constant state eye on the street, that was an alarming sign. Many thinkers and jurists of that era operated on a very simple logic. As long as a person had not committed a crime, they should not constantly feel the living presence of authority nearby. Otherwise, a free citizen turns into an object of constant suspicion. A patrol on the corner, regular rounds, observation of everyday movement, all of this could easily be perceived as a slide toward tyranny. In theory, this seemed noble. It was backed by real memory of power's abuses. But the industrial city introduced its own destructive element into this noble scheme. It created an environment where a criminal could exploit the very invisibility that liberal thought considered normal for an honest person. The huge city became a place where the old philosophy of freedom and the new reality of anonymous masses began to sharply diverge. The paradox was colossal. The same societies that built courts, developed legal science, and spoke of order and law simultaneously feared embodying that order on the street in the form of a permanent man in uniform. Law was supposed to exist as a principle, but not as a daily, visible, step-by-step force walking the pavement. This is precisely why the transition to a professional police force proved so difficult. It required not only a bureaucratic decision, but also a deep shift in the very understanding of where freedom ends and the necessity of control begins. The old answer no longer worked, but admitting this openly was not easy. And yet, what finally broke the old hesitation was not street crime itself. That was tolerated for a long time. The real turning point came when the authorities began to see the city street not merely as a dangerous place, but as a potential source of political explosion. The French Revolution changed Europe's perception of the city more profoundly than is sometimes acknowledged. Before it, the street seemed a space of daily life, commerce, random conflicts, crime, and urban poverty. After it, the street suddenly appeared as a place where an event capable of toppling an entire regime could be born. Not the palace, not the battlefield, not a conspiracy behind closed doors, but precisely the street. This was a terrifying discovery for those in power. because a pickpocket threatens an individual. Even a gang threatens a neighborhood. But a political crowd threatens the very principle of domination. It calls order itself into question. People gathered together, seeing their own numbers and their own strength, became a new historical force. And this force no longer fit into the old methods of governance. After the revolutionary experience, European governments began to view the city quite differently. Now the danger of the street was measured not only by the number of crimes. The authorities increasingly asked a different question. What happens when the energy of discontent accumulates in the street? Who will notice the unrest first? Who will understand where agitation is growing? Who will see the moment when an ordinary crowd begins to transform into a political body? It is here that the idea of the police acquires a new meaning. It becomes not merely a response to crime. It becomes a tool for the early detection of a threat that has not yet committed a crime, but may already become disorder, rebellion, protest, or a coup. The street proves dangerous not because wallets are stolen there, but because collective power emerges there. This shift was enormous. It changed the very meaning of order. Order was no longer reduced to silence in the absence of brawls. It began to mean the manageability of mass urban space. And the first major laboratory for this new way of thinking was Paris, the city where the authorities attempted to link the street, surveillance, and information into a single system. Napoleonic-era Paris showed Europe very early that a professional police force was not just a service on the streets. It was an entire machine of knowledge about the city. The prefecture of police in the early 19th century was something more than an office or a chain of patrols. It collected information, compared, classified, distributed surveillance by district, monitored not only crime, but also the public mood. Here, the figure of Joseph Fouché comes to the fore. His name almost became synonymous with political police instinct. What's important is not the personality itself, but the principle that emerges through it. A city can be controlled not only by force, but also by a network of informants, tipsters, minor observers, denouncers, and officials who gather scattered fragments of urban life into unified knowledge. The tavern, the theater, the coffee house, the salon, the market, all could become a source of signals. It is here that a new dream of power appears, not just to punish the guilty after an event, but to know in advance where danger is brewing. Who is meeting with whom? What rumors are circulating in the district? Where irritation is growing? Where people are gathering whose behavior cannot yet be called criminal, but is already hard to call harmless. In this sense, the Napoleonic police became a prototype for a much broader future. But within the same system, its own poison also manifested. A surveillance machine once created begins to know too much, not only about the regime's enemies, but also about the regime itself. Not only about suspicious circles, but also about those who give the orders. A police system, if effective, inevitably becomes a repository of dangerous knowledge. And the authorities quickly understand that a tool of control can one day turn into a source of anxiety for the controller himself. Therefore, the Parisian experience proved dual. It was admired for its efficiency and simultaneously feared for its political meaning. Europe saw that a professional police force worked, but along with that, it also saw how closely it was linked to the image of spying, despotism, and covert oversight. And it was in this atmosphere that Britain had to resolve its own question. It too needed a new urban tool, but it had to be introduced in such a way that society would not feel that, under the guise of order, it was being offered a continental model of permanent control. Robert Peel understood the main point. In Britain, one could not simply declare, professional police forces would now constantly walk the streets, and this should be accepted as an obvious good. Too many would see in this not protection, but a dangerous precedent. For the British public imagination, a permanent police force could easily seem a step toward that very state from which it was accustomed to keeping its distance. Therefore, the new system had to be made desirable, not imposed head-on. And here begins an especially subtle political work. Society had to feel that without the police, the city could no longer be held. That freedom without constant street order had become too costly. That chaos had come too close. In the second half of the 1820s, the conversation about crime in London became noticeably sharper. Newspapers described attacks in more detail, more grimly, more dramatically. The reader was not simply informed of a fact. They were given the sensation of a city slipping from their grasp. Nighttime London began to look not just troubled, but almost unmanageable. And this is a very important shift, because political decisions are rarely made through statistics alone. They are made through a public sense of necessity. Of course, crime was not an invention. It was real and often brutal. But in the history of reform, what matters is not only the problem itself, but also the way it is shown. Who amplifies the fear? Who translates anxiety into the language of salvation? Who creates the feeling that a new intervention by the authorities is no longer a controversial step, but the last reasonable means? It is in this context that the creation of the Metropolitan Police in 1829 appears not as a simple reaction to an objective crisis, but as a politically prepared turn. The authorities do not merely respond to chaos. They build public consent for their permanent presence in the city. But it is precisely here that a strange archival shadow appears. Because if the police were so carefully prepared for their official birth, the temptation arises to ask, did it not appear partially even earlier? Did it not take to the streets before the law had its final say? The story of the London tokens without names is troubling precisely because it fits too well into the overall logic of a transitional era. Formally, the police appear on a certain day. There is a date. There is a structure. There is a law. There is an official start. But behind official dates sometimes lie weeks or even months of preliminary practice that was preferred not to be put on display. According to one version, some people were recruited in advance and were already being used as observers, assistants to justices of the peace, or trial patrols. They did not exist in the full legal sense as a new police force, but they were already learning their future function, to be the eyes of the authorities on the street. If this is true, then the empty badge numbers become an especially expressive detail. It is a trace of a system that began operating before it dared to acknowledge itself publicly. This is how large institutions are born. Not at the moment of a solemn decree, but at the moment when practice has already moved ahead of the law. First, someone starts doing the new work. Then that work is formalized. Then it is given a name. Then society is told that it could not have been otherwise. But the first phase often remains in the shadows, precisely because it appears the most awkward. It shows that the authorities sometimes do not wait for full symbolic consent, but act while society is still just getting used to the new norm. Why was it important to hide this? Because opponents of the reform would have immediately gained a powerful argument. They would have said, the authorities are already behaving as if the decision has been made, even though society and parliament have not yet finished the debate. And then the question of the police would have turned not into a question of security, but into a question of trust in the very procedure. That is why this small archival anomaly is so valuable. It shows not just a bureaucratic oddity, but the very mechanics of the birth of a new era. The authorities are not yet ready to declare, "We have come to the streets for good." But they are already taking the first steps in precisely that direction. And if we look more broadly, it becomes clear that London was not alone here. In various European capitals, the police took shape in different ways. But the inner meaning of these systems often coincided surprisingly well. If we take Paris, St. Petersburg, and Berlin, we see three different administrative forms, but almost the same historical anxiety. Everywhere, the authorities sought a way not just to punish crime, but to make the urban flow of people observable, manageable, and predictable. Russia is particularly interesting in this sense. Formally, the urban police tradition there emerges very early. St. Petersburg gets its chief of police as early as the 18th century. On paper, this looks like a sign of being ahead. But if we look at actual practice, it becomes clear. The early police more often served the authorities as an apparatus for executing decrees, surveillance, and administrative coercion than as a system for the everyday protection of the ordinary city dweller. The safety of the common person often remained a secondary task. Post-Napoleonic Paris presents a different, but equally telling picture. Here, the police becomes a complex, multi-layered structure where various branches of surveillance intertwine and, in places, monitor not only the street, but also each other. Political control, moral control, municipal administration, information gathering. All this forms a dense system where crime turns out to be just one part of a broader task. Berlin, after the revolutionary upheavals of the mid-century, reveals the logic even more plainly. There, the police function is directly linked to the surveillance of gatherings, the printed word, potentially unreliable people, and everything that could escalate into political unrest. That is, the street is perceived not as a neutral space, but as a zone where signs of a possible explosion need to be caught in advance. This is why the history of urban police is so hard to reduce to a single noble formula. Yes, it gradually made some streets safer. Yes, it fought crime. But at the same time, it was born as a tool for the broader management of the city. Management of movement, assembly, behavior, noise, suspicion, and the appearance of order. And if that is the case, then the next question becomes almost inevitable. Fine, we have seen the political intent. But what did practice show? Who did the early police actually catch most often? The most dangerous criminals, or those who simply violated the form of urban normality desired by the authorities? When you look at early police reports and statistics, it quickly becomes clear. The daily work of the new police did not always revolve around the most high-profile crimes. Yes, murders, robberies, and serious cases existed. But a huge part of the actual activity was related to what was called a breach of the peace. A drunk on the street, suspicious behavior, vagrancy, noise, a fight. an inappropriate gathering of people. Trading where it is not permitted. A person simply standing without a clear purpose in a place where their presence seems unnecessary. All of this became a subject of attention, and it is here that the true function of the early police is revealed. It did not just catch criminals. It learned to sort the very flow of the city. The police determined who looked normal and who stood out, who fit into the rhythm of the managed city, and who created a sense of dangerous uncertainty. It worked not only with crime, but with behavior, not only with guilt, but with deviation. And that is an entirely different level of power. This was especially vivid against the backdrop of the growing working class. The industrial proletariat was a new force. People without the old estate protections, without land, without guild frameworks, but gathered in huge numbers in one space where they could see the commonality of their hardships and learn to act together. For the existing order, this was more alarming than any street gang. A gang robs. A mass can demand change. That is why the police so quickly proved useful not only against crime, but against any forms of street collectivity that could get out of control. It became a buffer between the authorities and the city, between the elite and the crowd, between the fear of disorder and the real presence of that fear on the streets. But here it is important not to fall into too simple a scheme. The police did change the city. Many districts became quieter. The night street became more predictable. This was especially noticeable in affluent neighborhoods, much less so in the poorest zones. The city did not become uniformly safe. It became unevenly controlled. The visible part of order was strengthened. The invisible part continued to resist. And it is at this moment that technologies enter the game, allowing the authorities to aim not only at the street, but at the individual person. Why did all this finally take shape precisely in the 19th century? Because three forces converged at once. The first, the growth of cities and crime. The second, the authorities' fear of the political street. And the third, the technical possibility of finally making the large city observable. Gas lighting and then electric light changed the very nature of night. The telegraph drastically accelerated the transmission of information. Photography opened the way to recording faces. Archives and filing systems became increasingly important. The railroad changed the speed of moving people and forces. What was once almost impossible gradually turned into a working system. For the first time, the large city became susceptible to the constant collection and processing of data about itself. And here emerges the next idea, far more profound and unsettling. If we can observe the street, why not learn to observe each person as a bearer of traits that can be measured, recorded, and compared? Thus appear the first serious attempts at scientific identification. The body begins to be seen as a source of data. Facial features, proportions, measurements, descriptions of appearance all become a step toward a future world where the individual is increasingly inseparable from their own registered shadow. But there is also a crucial paradox. The 19th century police desperately wanted to be all-seeing. In practice, they long remained a system that was only learning this art. Archives were muddled, names were duplicated, descriptions were imprecise. The same person could appear in different places under different guises. That is, the urban police of that time were not a perfect machine of control, but rather a grand design that constantly lagged behind its own ambitions. This is precisely why the image of London's nameless tokens is so powerful. It seems to compress the entire history. Between a world without a permanent police force and a world where the street had already become a territory of the state's continuous presence, there existed an intermediate moment, when the system was already in operation, but not yet fully acknowledged. When control had already taken to the streets, but had not yet found its fully confident language. When the new order was already walking the pavement, and the old one still pretended nothing had changed. And perhaps this is the most important conclusion. The urban police were born not only as a shield for citizens, they were also born as the authorities' response to the fear of the street itself, to the crowd, to anonymity, to those who could not immediately be fitted into a comprehensible scheme. They made the street safer, and simultaneously made it more manageable. They reduced a portion of the chaos and expanded the space of the state's gaze. Today, we see an officer on the corner and hardly think that before us lies the trace of one of the greatest turning points of the 19th century. The moment when the city ceased to be merely a place of life and became a territory of the authorities' constant presence. Not rare, not accidental, not merely punitive after a disaster, but daily. And those empty numbers in the old London archive remain silent to this day. And perhaps it is precisely this silence that speaks the loudest. Because power is almost never born on the day it later cites in documents. First, it simply steps out onto the street, and only then does it declare that this was always necessary. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notifications. Here, we examine the past not as a collection of dates, but as a mechanism that still governs the present. And the more closely you look into such archival cracks, the clearer it becomes. The most important changes often begin not with a loud decree, but with a quiet step on a nighttime street.